we may start. How long time will you be?
Maybe 40 minutes.
Okay.
Or, I mean, but I'm very happy for interruptions, because if you don't understand something or you have a question in the middle, it's fine to ask.
Okay.
It's very relaxed.
Yeah, I think so. Maybe some people may come later. Shall we start?
Yeah, you can start.
What was the rules? Now we start. Today we are going to listen to Professor Penny Green, who is from Queen Mary University of London, and she is head of State Crime Initiative. We think it is a very important initiative, and it is very important to understand the concept of state crime and use that understanding for other occasions. She's going to speak about the case of Rohingya. Hello. She's going to speak about the fate of the Rohingya, what we call Burmese Muslims or Muslims of Myanmar, Rakhine. Please, thank you.
Well, thank you, and it's great to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me this year. I'm going to talk today about the genocide of the Rohingya. It's not widely accepted yet as a genocide. I mean, that's been part of our mission, if you like, having done the research, is to persuade and advocate on the part of the Rohingya that what has happened to them, that the nature of the persecution that they've experienced is indeed genocide. That was the one I was looking for. I didn't delete the first. This is okay. This is the first time I suspect that most people would have been made aware of the Rohingya. This was in 2015, and we have here an image that went around the world of Rohingya refugees who are fleeing Sitwe, the capital, and the region around the capital of Myanmar. Here they've been stranded in the Andaman Sea. They've been abandoned by the traffickers who owned the ships and who were taking them to other countries. So they were stuck without water and without food and without motor. So they were just floating. And it was a desperate situation, and the world saw this as a humanitarian crisis. And again, we have another humanitarian crisis in 2017. And here we have some Rohingya refugees arriving in Poredwip in Bangladesh. They're fleeing what we would call the final stages of Myanmar's genocide against them. I'll say a lot more about that in a moment. But the problem for us is, and this is where they were coming, of course, to Kutupalong refugee camp. And this is a vast refugee camp. Around 1 million people are living in this open-air refugee camp. And it was created in a matter of months. So from having 200,000 people in it prior to 2017, I beg your pardon, 2017. 200,000 people lived. They had been victims of earlier pogroms, had fled Myanmar in the past, but within 2 months, between August and October of 2017, 800,000 more arrived in this camp. Now, one of the problems with the way it's constructed as a humanitarian crisis, one of the problems that we have, is that once an issue is defined as a humanitarian crisis, then the causes are lost. The nature of what created the humanitarian crisis becomes secondary. And I think that's very problematic when we're looking at a genocide. So I want to work backwards a little bit. You start with the humanitarian crisis, this refugee crisis as it's most commonly referred to now, and work backwards to look at the state crime framework which basically led to the exodus of the Rohingya, and specifically the state crime of genocide. And working backwards, as I want to, this is an image from inside Bangladesh looking back to Myanmar. So where you see the smoke cloud, they are villages burning inside Myanmar, being observed by refugees who have just fled. And that river is the Naf River. That marks the border between Myanmar and Bangladesh. So if I can say something about the project, and then I'll say a little bit more about state crime and then go into the genocide. We visited Myanmar as part of another project. We were looking at resistance to state violence in 2012, and we heard rumours about violence taking place in Rakhine State against the Rohingya ethnic minority. And so we decided that we would investigate what was going on in Rakhine State. So we got some funding and we went back in 2014 and 15 to do a serious study. It's a 12-month investigation of what was happening in Rakhine State. And we were very interested then to look at the whole community, to understand perpetrators as well as victims. And so we interviewed 176 people, and they included, as you can see here, the Rakhine, and the Rakhine are the majority ethnic group. They're still an ethnic minority in the whole of Myanmar, but they are the majority ethnic group in Rakhine State, about 2/3 of that population. Extremists amongst the Rakhine were responsible for the violence in 2012, but they were backed by the state.
Buddhists.
The Rakhine are Buddhists. Yep. We interviewed members of civil society, Rakhine civil society, and international NGOs. We interviewed monks who, as you will see, have been central to this genocide. And we interviewed politicians and government officials, as well as business people. The second part of the study was more spontaneous, and that took place in Bangladesh. We went out last November while people were still fleeing across the border. They are still coming now in dribs and drabs. And so we went to Bangladesh. We were there for a much shorter period, but a very intensive period, and we interviewed about 70 people, 45 in real depth. And the kind of people we wanted to interview in the second part, because the first part was looking at what had happened up to 2015, what had been going on that told us this would explain to us the nature of the persecution. By the time we went to Bangladesh, we were very clear that it was a genocide, and we'd established that case. What we were interested in here was trying to work out how planned the final stages of the genocide had been. And this is just an image. So these are at the top left-hand, these are my colleagues, Tom McManus and Alicia Delacour-Venning. It was the three of us who were involved in this project. Down below, we're in a camp. You can see Tom in the background and children gathering around. And our first report was published in 2015, A Countdown to Annihilation, Genocide in Myanmar. And in that report, on the final page, in 2015, we warned that if the international community did not recognise what was happening inside Myanmar as a genocide, then we would see the final stages of mass annihilation and the complete restructuring of Rakhine State, if you like, to airbrush the Rohingya from Myanmar's history. We made that prediction in 2015, and unfortunately in 2017 it came to bear. So now I'll talk a little bit about the state crime paradigm that we have developed. In 2009 or 10, I set up the International State Crime Initiative with my colleagues, and one of the things that my colleague Tony Ward and I had been working on, we're criminologists. And criminology is obsessed with crimes of the powerless, obsessed with the crimes that take place in the street, obsessed with the crimes of the working class. I belong to the critical criminology stream, which is much more interested in crimes of the powerful. And very few people had been working on crimes of the state. There were some people working on crimes of corporations, but corporate crime, but very few were working on crimes committed by states, because it's quite difficult. I mean, states protect themselves in many ways. And so Tony Ward and I didn't want to rely on legal definitions of crime, because states and state legislatures make laws. They define what is ultimately criminal in any society. So we needed a better definition than a legal definition. And the definition that we came up with was human rights violations perpetrated by state agents. But those human rights violations had to be in the interests of a state organisational goal. There had to be a state reason why it was in the interests of that police unit or this government department to breach moral and often legal norms. And so that was very important to us. So that's the definition we operate. I mean, very often the crimes we're talking about are crimes in law, but not always. And the law is a very cumbersome instrument. And so for us it's really important to use these three elements of the definition in order to work out whether or not it's a state crime, or whether or not it's an individual police officer engaging in a criminal practice for his or her own gratification. That would be different. That would not be a state crime. That would be a crime committed by an individual police officer for their own interests. So we were interested in when states do these kinds of, engage in corruption or violence for a specific state goal or purpose. So that's the framing. And within that framework, there are many crimes: torture and state corporate crime, and genocide is one of them. And we have used the work of Daniel Fierstein, who is a genocide scholar, an Argentinian genocide scholar, who's done some fascinating comparative work on what happened in Argentina during the 70s and 80s and the Holocaust, and drawing the parallels. And for us, he came up with a six-stage understanding of genocide, which I'll come to in a moment. But I think the very important thing about both our definition and Fierstein's is that state crime is a process, it's not an event. Law deals with events, an act, a behaviour. But actually, when we look at state crime, if we look at torture or we look at genocide, we see a process. You can't torture people unless you have created a culture in which the people you're torturing are less than yourselves. So there's been a process of stigmatisation and othering and dehumanising that particular group. And so it's really important to understand it as a process, and that's the idea that our definition captures this, but the law does not. And we also, of course, use the work of Raphael Lemkin. Now, Lemkin was a Polish Jewish jurist who came up with the term genocide. He was very interested, not driven by his position as a Jewish person and in relation to a Jewish group. He did it before the Holocaust. He was interested before. He was interested in the way the Armenians were targeted as a particular group by the Ottomans. He was interested in the Native American Indians. He was interested in a whole range of groups that had been targeted because of their group character, rather than individuals. So Lemkin talked about the destruction of essential foundations of life of national groups with the aim of annihilating those groups. So his work is really important. And the other theorist that we use is Claudia Card. And she's interesting because she talks about genocide as social death. So I think it's really important for us to understand that genocide isn't necessarily achieved through total mass killing. Mass killing will be a part of it, is usually a part of it, but you can annihilate a population, commit genocide without mass killing. And so this is what we would argue. There has been mass killing of the Rohingya, but actually the Myanmar Rohingya, and that's the identifying group, are virtually gone from Myanmar. They live in Bangladesh or they are part of the diaspora. So it's very important. So Claudia Card talks about genocide as social death, that somehow genocide, what it does is it sucks the vitality, the social vitality out of a group. The kind of the purpose that people have in terms of their group identity and the lives that they live accordingly are dramatically diminished by processes of genocide. And so certainly when we went into the camps in Myanmar in 2014, we were struck by the mass depression, the inability to do anything, the inactivity, the misery, the wretchedness of the camps. And you really did feel that the social vitality had been taken from this group, that they weren't able to organise or lead purposeful lives. And I'll talk more about the camps in a moment. Please, if you have any questions, just ask along the way. So, who are the Rohingya? They are a Burmese or Myanmar. We tend to use Burma and Myanmar interchangeably. Burma usually for the historical analysis, because of course it was Burma, and Myanmar when we talk about the present, but we do interchange. So they're a self-identified Muslim ethnic minority. They have their own language, the Rohingya. It's not a written language, it's an oral language. They are located in the western part of Burma, in a state called Rakhine State. And up until around 2016, and this is only an estimate because the Rohingya were not included in the 2014 census, because in order to be included in the census, the Rohingya had to define themselves as Bengali. So they refused to take part. So we think there are between 1.2 and 1.4 million Rohingya in Rakhine State. 35% of the state's population were Muslim Rohingya, and the Buddhist Rakhine around 58%, as I mentioned earlier. And when you go and you see some ancient mosques and some of the historical writings of British colonialists and people who earlier, it seems that they have had an historical presence for at least 300 years. Now, I'm not sure this matters, actually, but this is what the evidence shows us. I mean, even if they'd had a presence for 30 years, nothing justifies what has happened to them. And I think it's a slight red herring, but nonetheless, this is a, do we have a, yeah, I can show you, oops. This is Rakhine State, and this is the capital, Sitwe. This is the border with Bangladesh. And it's important to kind of humanize the Rohingya, I think, and these are some of the people that we met. I mean, they're just images, but these were people outside the ancient town of Marau. It's very, very famous for its temples, its Rakhine temples. And the Rakhine themselves feel very under threat inside Myanmar, it's important to say. And they have been working to re-establish. I mean, they talk about re-establishing the kingdom. I'm sorry?
When you say Rakhine threatened by whom?
By the Myanmar Burma. The dominant group inside Myanmar are the Burma.
Right.
And so they are a minority, even though they're the majority in this particular state. but inside Myanmar. I mean, it's the second poorest state in Myanmar. Their education system is appalling. They want to be able to use their language, the Rakhine language, and you know, there are similarities, I'm sure, as you will recognise. But nonetheless, they feel oppressed. But these are Rohingya people, and they were in what we call prison villages, because in fact it's almost impossible after 2012 for these people to leave their villages without being attacked by Rakhine extremists. Some children in a camp, one of the camps. So I mentioned that Daniel Fierstein talks about genocide as a process and in stages. Now, these are the 6 stages of genocide. They often coexist. They're not necessarily linear, though they tend to follow this pattern. And so I'll run through each of these in a moment, but stigmatization, harassment, geographic and social isolation, systematic weakening, mass annihilation, and then something that we call symbolic enactment. And now I will go through each of these to give you some idea about the way in which these stages operated. Now there's some discussion about whether or not the Rohingya had citizenship prior to the 1982 citizenship law. But effectively, they had the rights of citizens up to this point. After 1982, when General Ne Win introduced the citizenship law, he excluded the Rohingya from the list of 135 national minorities. And in effect, the Rohingya became a stateless population. Throughout the country, I mean, Myanmar is an incredibly racist country. It's xenophobic and racist at every level. It's very disheartening for people like us who do this kind of research and advocacy, because you can't work with Myanmar civil society. They do not stand in solidarity with the Rohingya. Very, very few of them. They accept the government line that the Rohingya are illegal Bengali immigrants. And that is, since 2002, that has been, if you like, the dominant discourse. And coupled with that is that Muslims are terrorists, that Muslims are overproduced, they have too many children, that they are business monopolizers, and so on. So all of these factors are used to justify discrimination and the stigmatization of the Rohingya.
Just one question.
Yeah, sure.
If they have been there, which we know that they have been there over 300 years in that place, they should be owning something. There must be a history of private property saying that my great-grandfather had this building, so there must be lots of proof that
yes,
they are part of that society.
That's right, and identity cards that were very important. You know, particularly the pink card, which virtually afforded citizenship, was very important. But at various stages, when the regulations changed, the Rohingya have been forced to hand over their identity cards in order to be given new identity cards, which, if you like, successively removed their legitimacy within the country. Since 1994, most Rohingya babies haven't been issued with birth certificates, so this is a very key way in which the identity is removed. And you can't use the term Rohingya inside Myanmar. It's just, you have to use great care when you're talking about the Rohingya. Aung San Suu Kyi called in all the American ambassador and instructed the ambassador that they were not to use the term Rohingya. And this was an instruction that went out to all diplomats in 2016. As I said, there are racist stereotypes abound, illegal Bengalis, but Kala, the term Kala is the equivalent of nigger. And that was used by... but this was used by the Rakhine State Attorney General when he was denying us access to the northern part of Rakhine State. We'd only want to talk to Kala. And they were excluded, as I said, from the 2014 census. Aung San Suu Kyi said, in fact, that they're not to be called Rohingya, but people who believe in Islam in Rakhine State. Now, the monks have been central to the, they've been a central conduit for hate speech and for this stigmatization. This is a picture of a monk called Ashin Wiratu. Time magazine called him the face of Buddhist terror. He has a temple in Mandalay which is covered in Islamophobic posters which have the bodies of so-called Buddhists slaughtered apparently by Muslims. And he travels the country spreading hatred against Muslims, encouraging Buddhists not to shop in Muslim stores, not to engage in business practices with Muslim businesses and so on. This was the 969 campaign, it was an anti-Muslim business campaign. He's been able to carry out his crimes under this new regime with impunity. He was arrested in the early 2000s, 2003, I think, and served a considerable number of years in prison, but he was imprisoned by the junta. He was not under the transition to democracy. He has been given free rein, effectively. He also initiated his organisation, Mabaka, a series of anti-Muslim laws. They were called the Protection of Race and Religion laws, and they were designed effectively to limit the life choices of Muslims in the country. So there were birth spacing laws, restricting the number of children that only Muslims could have, laws against polygamy. There's already a law against polygamy, so it was a symbolic gesture. Only Muslims have more than one wife. In all of our interviews, we didn't come across a single Rohingya with more than one wife. There were laws against religious conversion and laws restricting interfaith marriage. It was possible, but there were very kind of bureaucratic and difficult processes to go through, which would be very, very difficult if you were a Buddhist, for example, woman marrying a Muslim man. And here are the monks on one of their many demonstrations, and that banner says "No Rohingya in Rakhine's land." And they organise these demonstrations periodically and create an environment of real terror. So the harassment stage of genocide builds on the stigmatisation, and here the stigmatisation moves from the verbal to the physical. And what we were responding to with our first period of fieldwork was mass violence which took place in 2012, in June and October. And that was in the capital, Sittwe, in and around the capital. And what happened then was that Rakhine extremists, at the behest of Rakhine politicians, state officials, organised and planned violence against the Rohingya. There had been, the trigger was the rape and murder of a Buddhist woman, apparently by Muslims, Rohingya Muslims. And the response was a very orchestrated violent attack on the homes and bodies of Rohingyas living in the capital, Sittwe. So there are around 200 murders. Not a single prosecution has emerged as a result of those murders. Rohingya neighbourhoods were destroyed, they were torched. We learnt that all Rakhine homes in the region were leafleted and told to send at least one member of the family to certain pickup points where a coach met them and took them to an area where they were given refreshments and issued with torches, burning torches. And so that resulted in the destruction of so many villages, so many neighbourhoods. We talked about the denial of citizenship. There's also been a policy of disenfranchisement, that they were denied the opportunity to vote in the 2015 elections. And this is a kind of a violence, I think. It's part of the harassment anyway, combined with physical violence. And you're restricting the Rohingya more and more with every development. So what happened during the violence of 2012 was that the Rohingya were, actually I'll come back to that, let's look at this slide for a minute. As I mentioned, it was Rakhine extremists who were the perpetrators of the violence. It is true, however, that the police and the security forces were there and stood back. They did nothing to protect the Rohingya, so they were more than complicit. They waited 3 days before intervening, until after the killing and the burning had taken place. So these are the kind of comments that you hear from the Arakan National Party politicians and spokespeople. So the first, when the international community give them, the Rohingya, a lot of food and a lot of donations, they grow fat and they become stronger and they will become more violent. And then we were interviewing this Arakan National Party spokesperson in the party offices in Sittwe. And he was saying, well, according to the 1982 law, they don't have citizenship, they should be kept in prison, but really we need to build concentration camps. And then he went, oh, I don't mean concentration camps, I mean detention camps. But he knew very well what he was saying. And there's a lot of Nazi paraphernalia in Sittwe. A lot of the motorbike helmets have got SS on them, and you find Mein Kampf in translated versions of Mein Kampf on little bookstores in the street.
Just one question. How does it go together with Buddhism as a belief, system of belief?
Well, people might ask the same question about ISIS and Islam.
Well, there can be some explanations for that, but we thought that Buddhism was a sort of religion of peace in a way.
That's its public face, that's the promotion.
All right.
But I think we have to, I don't think Buddhism is you know, it's all very well not to step on not to kill a mosquito or bat away a flea, but the Rohingya, well, they're less than human and we don't care. And it's, you know, I think that, you know, all religions are hypocritical, and yeah, it certainly makes you reassess this idea of Buddhism as a peaceful. There is no doubt that there are some peaceful Buddhists, many peaceful Buddhists who would be horrified at this level of violence, or any violence. And here are their own demonstrations marching through Sittwe. And this is a demonstration not specifically targeted at the Rohingya, but at international NGOs like Oxfam or the UNHCR or the World Food Programme, the kind of humanitarian organisations and Médecins Sans Frontières who are providing assistance to the Rohingya because of their past situation. Now, and this is what the humanitarians are responding to. The violence that drove the Rohingya from their homes and communities in 2012 led them through an area. So basically the streets were lined with shouting Rakhine Buddhists. And we heard stories that people had smashed glass on the road, and the Rohingya were running barefooted, and they were driven into a particular area which we now call the camp complex. And there are 40 camps where between 120 and 140,000 Rohingya live.
Inside?
Just
Myanmar.
outside of Sittwe, yes, inside Myanmar, just outside the capital. And this is an area that the Rohingya can't leave. And there's one ghetto remaining in the capital, in Sittwe. It's called Ongmingala, and there are about 4,500 people living there in wretched conditions, because in the camps they are recognised as internally displaced people, and they receive from the UN, the World Food Programme, they receive rations. Those rations are limited, and they're very meagre, but they do receive rations. In Ongmingala, they're not recognised as IDPs, so they don't receive the rations. So now the Rohingya, when we were there, you had the majority of the Rohingya were living in Sittwe and around, had moved and forced to live in these camps, the ghetto, and what we call prison villages, which operated like camps. People couldn't leave them because if they left them, they would be attacked and beaten up or killed. So you had a situation of complete physical and social and geographical isolation, which is interesting if you think about the way in which you might move forward, because the Rakhine, you know, in all our interviews we talked about the past, what life was like in Sittwe. And it was a multicultural town with Hindus and Buddhists and Muslims and Miramaji and other smaller groups. And people were educated together, they went to mixed schools, they celebrated certain marriages and occasions together. They had their own ethnic celebrations as well. But there was a community. And once you physically and socially isolate people, then the Rakhine no longer see Rohingya, ever. And they are much more vulnerable to the kind of hate messages and hate crimes that the monks and the government purvey. So they listen to the discourse, and they've got nothing to counter it, if you like. They're not meeting ordinary Rohingya, their old friends anymore. They start to fear them.
Occupation-wise, who were Rohingya? Were they fishermen? Were they peasants, farmers,
all
or
those
businessmen,
things.
Money dealers, or who were
all those
they?
things, all those things. So in Sittwe there were a lot of, they would have in the marketplace stalls. So they were business people at a pretty low level, but they were quite, you know, that was a culturally, they were business people, but they also worked in the fields, they were fishermen, they did all sorts of things. They weren't an educated people particularly, but then very few people in Rakhine State are educated to any. There is one university in Sittwe, and Rohingya prior to 2012 were entitled to go to the university. But when we were there, that had finished for them. There was no chance, no Rohingya could go to the university, A, because they couldn't leave the camps, but and they were denied all the sort of citizens' rights that the Rakhine held. So this is one of the camps, just to give you some sense of what they were like. It's not a terribly good image, but it's one we took. Another one. I mean, they're very, they are deeply wretched places. And this is inside the ghetto, which is controlled. There are 7 checkpoints to the ghetto. And it's interesting, when George Soros visited, he flew in by helicopter, spent an hour or two in Ongmingala, but when he came out, he said he was reminded of his childhood in the early 1930s in Hungary. It reminded him of a Jewish ghetto. And he was horrified by this experience. And this is, again, in the ghetto, the military have occupied the only primary school in the ghetto, and that's their base. Once you have isolated a targeted group, it's much easier to weaken them, to destroy them if you like, through ways other than shooting them or killing them immediately. So what we have in the camps is this stage of systematic weakening. And this is the fourth stage of Daniel Fierstein's genocidal process. And we saw many instances of very, very malnourished babies. The World Food Programme did a study of northern Rakhine State. And I should say that northern Rakhine State I haven't talked about yet, and I will in a moment. But that was a no-go area for us. We tried to go. That's where the majority of the Rohingya were living in 2014. Probably around 800, 900,000, but we weren't able to go there. And the Myanmar authorities controlled it very tightly. Very rarely were any internationals allowed in there. So this, the World Food Programme did a study in 2016. This is before the denouement of the genocide. And they found that in northern Rakhine State, under normal living conditions for the Rohingya, 85% of children under 5 were suffering from malnutrition. So if you like, northern Rakhine State was itself physically and socially isolated. Though people had slightly more freedom, but not a lot, because if you wanted to move from one township to another, you had to apply for a permit. There were very many residences with other genocides here. So in this process of systematic weakening, people are stripped effectively of their agency, their capacity to be purposeful human beings, and they're stripped of human dignity. They live in these dreadful camps that I showed you that are overcrowded, squalid. There'll be one room for several families, no toilet in the hut. They have to walk quite some distance to latrines, which were themselves, I think, quite dangerous places. People have, all of their movement is restricted. They've got no freedom of movement. They have no access to healthcare. In 2014, Médecins Sans Frontières, the only health provider of emergency medicine for the Rohingya at that time, after 2012, because they couldn't go to the hospital in Sittwe, generally speaking, and there were, you might get a Rakhine doctor coming to a clinic for 1 hour or 2 hours a week, but the Rohingya didn't trust the Rakhine doctors, and the Rakhine doctors did not care for the Rohingya. So, but the Myanmar government expelled Médecins Sans Frontières from Rakhine State in 2014. So that really removed all emergency healthcare, access to emergency healthcare for the Rohingya. And as I said, depression, mental health issues were absolutely pervasive in the camps. So this is a process of destroying a people without actually physically killing them.
Some sort of final solution.
Yeah, it's a slow burn genocide. It's a kind of it's an attritional form of annihilation. So that's where we left. This is the stage that we found the Rohingya in when we went in 2014, and we wrote that first report. And as I said, we predicted what might happen if it wasn't recognised as a genocide, because it's important to know that if you recognise a form of persecution as genocide, if the UN calls it genocide, if states decide that it's genocide, then under the Genocide Convention, they are obliged to act. States are obliged to intervene, to prevent, and to punish. So that you can see that there are very powerful geopolitical reasons why states and the United Nations would not call it a genocide. We were the only people, academics, who had done systematic research and who were able to demonstrate empirically that this was a genocide when you benchmarked it to other genocides historically, but also when you looked theoretically at the genocide paradigm, this was a textbook example of genocide, not a textbook example of ethnic cleansing, as we'll see in a moment. And that's the use of the term ethnic cleansing is very, very problematic for that reason, because it avoids, it's a euphemism for genocide without the obligations that genocide determinations demand. So, 2017, August 25th, the Myanmar military launched what they called a series of military operations, clearances. And that involved targeting Rohingya villages in northern Rakhine State, the area that we hadn't got access to. So we couldn't, and nobody was allowed into northern Rakhine State in this period. And so there was, and I say alleged because we have no independent verification, there was an alleged attack on Myanmar border outposts, border police, right, on the Bangladesh border. A number of security officers were apparently killed, and the Myanmar government alleged that it was the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army, ARSA. Now, we don't have any independent verification of this, and regardless of whether this happened or not, ARSA, if they do exist, are tiny, ramshackle, have really limited weaponry. There's a very strong, I think there's evidence to suggest that this was actually a Myanmar state false flag operation. But nonetheless, they used that as a trigger for the final solution, if you like, the end, the final stages of genocide. And so, in the course of 2 months, we saw over 350 villages burnt and 800,000 Rohingya forced to leave their homes, to flee, not only leave their homes, but to flee Myanmar, to cross the border. This is the child remains of a market. You know, the markets were targeted. It's very interesting what was targeted. Leaders were targeted, teachers, the educated imams were targeted, village administrators, marketplaces, mosques. So one of the questions that we were interested in, though, when we went into the Bangladesh camps, because this was our chance, all of a sudden the people that we were not entitled to speak to, were not allowed to speak to, because the Burmese government would not allow us to go into northern Rakhine State. All of a sudden we now have access to them because they are no longer in Myanmar. They're no longer in northern Rakhine State. They are in Burma. They are in Bangladesh. So we flew to Bangladesh, as I said, for the second part of this study. It was spontaneous. And we wanted to, there was a lot of evidence from NGO reports and from the Rohingya themselves. The Rohingya were taking images and using their cell phones and getting information out about what had happened. But we wanted to know what was happening in the build-up. These were the Myanmar government was claiming that this was simply a response. And actually, we were able to demonstrate that there were a series of events prior to August which indicated that this was a planned attack and it had been planned for a long time. So here we have the mass annihilation stage. The Rohingya spoke of curfews and movement restrictions on what they were able to do in the months before the final assault. As I said, over 350 villages were destroyed. We think around 25,000 were killed. Médecins Sans Frontières did a mortality study, and they came up with their top figure was 13,000, but they took only 1 month, a 1 month period, from August 25th to September 26th, I think. And within that period, they talked to around 1,000, it was a household survey, So they interviewed about 1,000 people, and they wanted to know if anybody in the household had been killed. But what this meant was that if a whole household was destroyed, then you wouldn't get that information. And then people were dying from starvation and other forms, and the people remaining. So we think that it's 20 to 25,000 is a more accurate estimate, but it's still an estimate. 800,000 were forced to flee. We're not the only ones, but there have been a number of studies now in Bangladesh to show that gang rape was widespread, that the military engaged in mass gang rape of Rohingya women. And this is a genocidal strategy to dilute the ethnic purity. And so we found that there was a lot of evidence to suggest that there were troop deployments in the months leading up to the final stages. As I said, sometimes the curfews were initially they were from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. For some people it became, for some villages, 24 hours. The military and the BGP, the Border Guard Police, were going in with Rakhine extremists and calling meetings and saying, you know, we want the bad people in this village, we want to arrest them, you've got to help us, the bad people, meaning ARSA. And so they were harassing and threatening. A number of people were tortured that we came across in the villages. Anybody who spoke against and said that there are no ARSA in this village, we don't know why you're asking these questions, they would be taken away, imprisoned, sometimes tortured, disappeared. So there was a lot going on prior to the final physical assault on the Rohingya of Northern Rakhine State. This is a picture of northern Rakhine State. It's made up of 3 townships: Mongdor, which you can see follows the border with Bangladesh, Butidong, and Ratadong down further south. So these are the main townships that make up northern Rakhine State and from which people fled. This is Sitwe down here. Yeah, but the military operations were only conducted in northern Rakhine State. Post-August. That's an image of the village of Tulatoli burning. Tulatoli experienced the very worst massacre. Around 2,000 people were killed by the military and the Border Guard Police and Rakhine extremists. And this is taken on the phone of the village administrator, Sultan Ahmed, and he took this image. And here's some satellite imagery of burnt Rohingya villages. And a drone image which captures it very well, I think. You can see there's nothing remaining of Rohingya life. These are images that were taken by the Rohingya themselves on their flight. They travelled in very large numbers for protection, and they travelled, for some people, if they were coming from Ratadong, it might have taken them 3 weeks. If they were travelling from Mongdor, it might take them 1 day, 2 days, 3 days. But for these people, they were crossing the Mayu Mountains. It was a very arduous journey, and they were always fearful of running into the military or Rakhine extremists.
And there's already something burning at the end.
Yes, you can see, indeed. This was a very typical image because the ill and the elderly had to be carried like this. And this is the camp they came to. This is Kutupalong refugee camp in Bangladesh. It changes all the time. And it's the monsoon season now, so we're going to be seeing, we've already seen a death from landslides. They're built on hills that have been denuded of trees. And this is Sultan Ahmed, the village administrator I mentioned. And in a week prior to the village being destroyed, the military came and called a public meeting and intimidated him and threatened the village. And one of the things that they did was they ordered the destruction of Sultan Ahmed's home. This is before, a week before the village was completely destroyed. And in the way of the Israeli state, they made local Rohingya destroy Sultan Ahmed's house. So this poor fellow who was in Sultan Ahmed's hut when we visited him, he was one of those who had to tear down Sultan Ahmed's home. Mumtaz Begum was also in that. She's from Tulatoli. She was burnt very badly in the fire, but survived. These are images of the camps. This is the distribution queue for food or other goods. But life goes on. Here's somebody having their hair cut. That woman was wanting a clinic. She wanted, her baby was unwell. The open sewers everywhere. There's no sanitation.
Cholera, isn't it?
Cholera is a real risk. And this is us in one of the huts doing interviews. These were villagers, women who had been attacked in the village of Chutpin in Ratadon. And while we were in Bangladesh, Aung San Suu Kyi made her very first visit to northern Rakhine State. She had refused to visit Rakhine State during the 2015 elections. She refused to stand any Muslim candidates. Before, her party had stood Muslim candidates. And she came and she said to the Rakhine, "Don't quarrel, live peacefully, we will look after you." She arrives in a military helicopter flanked by generals. At the same time, Ashin Wiratu, the face of Buddhist terror, also arrived in Rakhine State, in Sitwe. These are triumphalist arrivals. You know, we've won, they've gone. The Rohingya have gone, basically. And to appease the Rakhine. Now, the very final stage of genocide, there's one more after the mass annihilation of a people. And here, when I talk about mass annihilation, as you can see, it's not just the killing of people. It's the destruction of their identity. Symbolic enactment is about the, if you like, the state which has perpetrated the genocide, remaking the state with the victim group removed historically. And so here we have, during the attacks, during the so-called military genocidal clearances, the mosques, the madrasas, houses, villages, fields, food stocks, crops, livestock and trees were all destroyed. So everything that identified the place, the geography of the Rohingya life was destroyed. You know, Rohingya wouldn't recognize.
So that you cannot remember.
Yeah, that's right. And so they wouldn't be able to identify. They wouldn't, if the trees are gone and the houses, now the Myanmar state has been bulldozing the remains. So it's even more difficult to determine where the Rohingya lived. The Rakhine and the military and the border guard police appropriated Rohingya property as soon as they fled. They started harvesting the crops. They started, taking over property if it wasn't destroyed. They are beginning to establish new military, residential, and economic infrastructure in the region. In Myanmar, all burnt land reverts to state ownership. So anything burnt goes back to the ownership of the Myanmar state. And they've also, and this attempt was happening earlier, but they are trying to repopulate northern Rakhine State with Buddhist communities. They even, some years ago, released prisoners, traditional prisoners, murderers, rapists, and so on, and said you can be released early if you go and live in northern Rakhine State in these fabricated villages, but they will be Buddhist villages. I don't think that was a terribly successful project, but this is continuing. So it's the creation of a new society, a new Buddhist, Rakhine and Burma society in the absence of the Rohingya Muslim society. And of course, the Myanmar state is engaged in a denial discourse. So, you know, it didn't happen. The victims themselves were responsible. When Jonathan Head from the BBC was taken through northern Rakhine State, just after many of the clearances, on a very orchestrated, structured, managed visit by the Myanmar military, even he was able to see that Hindu women were set up holding torches about to burn a house down, and the Myanmar state claimed that was Rohingya burning their own villages down. That it was self-defense. I mean, and they've also engaged in outright lies. One of the ways in which they've engaged in denial is not allowing independent journalists in, so there's no counter-narrative. So there's the Myanmar state narrative, and you have the Rohingya victims, but there are no independent voices because the Myanmar state has ensured that nobody is allowed in. Aung San Suu Kyi gave a speech, I don't know if you remember, on the 5th of September last year. And on the 5th of September, she announced that the military clearances were over. They were happening as she spoke, and they continued to happen for weeks and weeks after. So she has engaged in not only denial, but outright lies in order to cover up the crimes. And of course, they've engaged in this counter-terrorism discourse, blaming, you know, the Rohingya are terrorists. That's the reason this was in self-defense. We had to defend Myanmar against these Muslim terrorists. And so we have a whole web of denial and lies. When we published our report, this is the government's mouthpiece, the Global New Light of Myanmar. The government and the people do not recognise the term Rohingya as it is an invented terminology, and they quote our report as one of the reports that is lying about the Rohingya. Another case of denial, there were clearances in 2016 in October. There was an ARSA attack on the 9th of October 2016, a year before, apparently, the August 2017 attacks. Then Aung San Suu Kyi's office, the State Councillor's office, this is her Facebook page. And at that time, in those clearances, there were many, many allegations of mass rape. Aung San Suu Kyi's office put this post up, fake rape, fake rape. The Tatmadaw are the Burmese military, and you couldn't make this up really. They call themselves the Tatmadaw True News Information Team. And these are some of the quotes from the Tatmadaw True News Information Team. The Rohingya are burning down their own villages. Violence is a conspiracy by international human rights groups. And then they conducted their own investigation into the allegations that the Rohingya had made. And it was, as you can imagine, an absurd investigation. And this was the conclusion. The security forces did not commit shooting at innocent villagers and sexual violence and rape cases against women. They did not arrest, beat and kill the villagers. They did not totally destroy, rob and take property, gold and silverwares, vehicles and animals. I think they owned up to the theft of one bicycle. This is General Min Aung Hlaing. He is the Commander-in-Chief of the military, of the Myanmar military forces. And this is very telling. This gives us an indication of how planned this final assault, the genocidal assault, was. He said the Bengali, and he means here the Rohingya, problem was a long-standing one which has become an unfinished job, despite the efforts of previous governments to solve it. The government in office is taking great care in solving the problem. And here they are, genocidaire together, Aung San Suu Kyi and Min Aung Hlaing. And this is the final slide, and I think we owe it to the Rohingya to give them the final word. Zura Khatu is from Rathdong Township. She's got a baby under her shawl here. She was an extraordinary woman, and she had walked many weeks to get across the border. Her 9-year-old son was killed, and her husband, and she fled with her remaining children and baby. And she was slow as a result of the children and the baby. And she kept falling behind, and then a new group would pick her up and she'd travel with them for a while. And at one point she came across the Myanmar military, and they said to her, if you want food, you should go that way. And she said, I only want to go where I can be Rohingya. So I think I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Well, anybody having questions? I will have some few questions before we continue. For the first, starting from the outside, what's the reaction of China, India, Thailand? Not talk about the Western countries who have thousands of satellites who can recognize a piece of coin under the soil, and they cannot find the mass burials and so on. That is the first question. Second question is, what is, if there is any, left's position in Myanmar? There must be some socialists, communists, or whoever. Do you have any information about their position? And third, well, that is a sort of, how do I say, general derivation from I derive that, for example, there must be some other reasons as well to get rid of these people, such as resources of oil, gas in the area. Do we have any information about this?
Okay.
That is a good reason to get rid of a whole population.
Yeah. Okay, I'll start, well, I'm not sure. I'll start with the first and we'll move. China and India have very significant investments in Myanmar. China has a gas pipeline that goes all the way from Rakhine State to China. Only the military, the military cronies inside Myanmar and the Chinese secure the profits of that gas pipeline. It's called the Shui gas pipeline. Similarly, India is building a very, very significant port in Rakhine State to transport goods straight across to Kolkata. And India, China and Russia have blocked any effort inside the UN Security Council. And then they have supported Aung San Suu Kyi. So they have very significant investments inside Myanmar and want to protect them. In terms of the communists and socialists, it's very difficult. The human rights activists that I've interviewed inside Myanmar for an earlier study, and they are people who did organise in the All Burma Students' Union, but in a very underground way. I mean, you have to remember that under the junta, it was incredibly difficult to organise at all. It was a civil underground. All people were fighting in the jungles, a civil war, and they tended to be the ethnic groups in the Kachin and the Karen and the Shan fighting the Myanmar military. So you really, in terms of workers' movements, very, very difficult to organise. I mean, in fact, the Burmese state had kind of co-opted civil society, had created a sort of a pseudo-civil society, which they could control very well. So it's interesting, but the human rights activists, who you might expect to be more socialist inclined and so on, unfortunately subscribe to the same racist ideology as the government and the military and the monks. So they haven't been a source of, they are extremely isolated, the Rohingya inside Myanmar. And the final question, Saskia Sassen wrote a piece in The Guardian saying that it's all about land. I mean, she hadn't done any research on it. And certainly in some cases land is very central. In Myanmar, land was not the driving force. Land is an issue now, after the genocide. but it was not a driving force. I think we talked earlier about British colonialism. The British created the seeds of communal division, but this isn't a communal issue. This is a state-sponsored genocide, a state-led genocide. The British favoured the people from the Indian subcontinent to sort of serve the Raj, to be the, if you like, the lower level civil servants, or the domestic servants, or to work in the fields over the Burmese. The British considered the Burmese to be lazy. So I think that actually it's that set a scene. It meant that historically there have been pogroms against the Rohingya, but in between, long periods of relative harmony and coexistence. I think that the long years of isolation, Burma was isolated for decades under Ne Win's form of National Socialism. And during that period of isolation, the country and its inhabitants became xenophobic. I mean, they came to fear strangers, and they came to fear and those who were different. And there's been a kind of a Burmaization process.
Paranoid society.
Yeah, a paranoid society, and the idea that you have a unified Burmese Buddhist Myanmar, not one that can countenance ethnic minorities. And those ethnic minorities have been in civil war since 1948, basically, with the Burmese military. So land is an issue now, I think. It becomes an issue. But it wasn't, we've no evidence that it was one of the drivers of the genocide. And the genocide has been in the making for about 3 decades. And I think it's driven largely by kind of ideology as much as anything. I'm going to have to go fairly soon. I'm really sorry. I notice it's 10 to 8.
Yeah. Any more questions? Be quick. I have one more basic question. If you could come back to the levels of genocide in your presentation.
Yes, sure.
That is a... was right at the beginning,
yeah.
Actually.
There we go.
Yeah, that one. Now, if we accept this, then the same framework can be used in many other cases. For example, Israel's attitude to Palestinians, yes. Turks, maybe Turkish state's attitude to Kurds, or you can just create lots of Sri Lankan government's attitude to Tamils.
Yeah.
And there are many. Yeah, there can be many explanations. This is a very good explanation. In my eyes, it tells us a lot.
Yes,
right.
It does. I think it's, and because it's systematic, and because it's based on Lemkin's work too. If you read Lemkin, who coined the term genocide, you can see that this is all from his work. And Daniel Fierstein has sort of, if you like, just elaborated and turned it into stages. But I think it's absolutely, I think it's terribly important, because people have, you know, there used to be the Holocaust-centric view of genocide, that only the Holocaust was a genocide, you know. But actually, if we look at the history of genocide and particular genocides, and we think about this framework, and when we study what we think are genocides, if this really tells the story, I think it's about the targeting of a group because of that group's identity, whether it's religious or national or ethnical or racial. Those, and I think that you can extend those groups, because in Argentina, they weren't a particular ethnic group or a religious group. But Daniel Fierstein argues they were part of the national group, and that's enough, and I think that's right. So, but I think they're incredibly helpful stages. And to think that they don't, as I said, it's not necessarily linear. You can have these stages operating at the same time. And in fact, all of those stages are operating basically right now.
How does it relate with the nation building?
I think, yeah.
That's number one. And the second question is, there was some minority rights before after the First World War, about the German speakings in especially in Czechoslovakia and Poland. And then after the Second World War, these rights completely wiped off, and everybody treated under the individual as an individual and in liberal ideology. I think there is a lot stamped on the liberal ideology, multiculturalism, and also taking those rights away. And now, gradually, they start to pick up some international declaration and etc., putting the rights back, because issue in everywhere has become very inflamed. Basically, I would like to see how you relate the nation building as well as the liberal ideology, and also the absence of human rights.
Well, I think you're right.
Sorry, not human rights, the minority rights.
Yes. No, I
variety.
Yeah. No, I think this is a nation building project actually.
Yeah.
You know, and it's driven by a sense of what the nation should look like, the new nation of Myanmar, and it's a nation that, because it's not just the Rohingya, all Muslims are targeted inside Myanmar, and in Yangon, Muslims can live quite relatively safely, but their mosques will be targeted and attacked at various points, and there are certain restrictions placed on all Muslims, and in other states within Myanmar, travel restrictions and so on. And I think it is, I think it is part of a nation building project. The idea that you have an undivided unity really, and that unity is based on religion and ethnicity in this case, and that's the BAMAR, who are the elite and the ruling group. They're also the majority group, the BAMAR, and Buddhist. And so Christian groups on the borders too, Christian groups like the Kachin or the Karen, and they've also been in civil war with the Myanmar state. And so I think what's happening to the Kachin is not dissimilar to what's happening to the Rohingya, but the Kachin have fought back. The Kachin have an independence army, the Rohingya do not. And so they haven't been annihilated in the same way that the Rohingya have, but they could be. So I think it is yes, it's a nation building project. In terms of liberal democracy, I wasn't quite sure what you were asking, but I think that, whilst there are claims that there is a move towards a democratic transition was actually initiated by Thein Sein, one of the generals, prior to Aung San Suu Kyi being released from house arrest. I think that it's more than a fragile and flawed democracy. It's not a democracy at all. It excluded the 1.2 million Rohingya from the electoral process. So I think that I think many people in the West wanted it to happen. Many people in the West wanted it to happen so much that they were prepared to ignore what Aung San Suu Kyi was presiding over, because they had fought so hard for her release. They had fought so hard and believed her previous yes, about democracy. Yeah. I don't know if I've answered your question, but
I mean, when I speak about the liberalism, fed the multiculturalism in itself. Multiculturalism.
I don't think it was a
is
liberalism inside Myanmar that fed multiculturalism. I mean, and there's not a lot of. I mean, I think that. Well, I don't know if you call it liberalism. I mean, but certainly there was coexistence, you know, for quite a long period. But you certainly, I mean, multicultural doesn't really capture it inside Myanmar.
Just, I would like to point something.
Yeah.
I think this is a latest crisis for Myanmar. Is very deeply belong to pipeline.
Yes.
Because, which I know is some Western, first of all, it's the United States government service, and Western government service provocate this pipeline against China.
The Shui gas pipeline.
Yeah, this is the main reason why people suffering there. Because this, after the Soviets collapse, some global strategic shift running nowadays since then. This one of them. This problem is exactly deeply belong to pipeline, very similar to Syria crisis, because Saudi and Qatar pipeline try to reach the Mediterranean Sea. Yeah. Assad said no, because of against to Russia and to Iran. This is why some other government manipulating that kind of crisis very deeply. I am not thinking only local problem. It's international problem.
Yes, I mean it's an international problem in the sense that the international community have done absolutely nothing for a range of geopolitical reasons, and some of that is self-interest, like with China and with India. I think that the gas pipeline was in operation, and China has other interests, you know, many other interests inside. I mean, it's rich in natural resources, Rakhine State, and so yes, I think that you can't ignore those. And I mean, if the international community had said we're going to reimpose sanctions, or we're going to, you know, visa restrictions on Aung San Suu Kyi and the generals, rather than court them, we might have had a different outcome. But I'm sorry, I'm very sorry, I'm already late.
The last question, Kenny?
No, first of all, thank you very much. It was a very useful presentation. And I myself am from Bangladesh, so I know quite a lot about what's going on. And I don't know whether you attended the Liberation Conference. We had a speaker, we had the MP, Rosina Ali Khan, who'd been there a few times. And as you say, I just want to endorse, it's a very difficult dilemma in terms of you have the two superpowers and India, who are taking a completely different line. India had given refuge to 10 million Bangladeshis during the 71 War of Liberation, when Bengalis fled the persecution genocide. Bangladesh now has got 1 million, and it can't obviously, with its own current problems, absorb all of them permanently, but they're doing the best. But the conditions are very, very bad. And Bangladesh has also got elections this year, so it's in a dilemma how to do, force this agreement they've signed with Myanmar is a complete whitewash. It's not going to happen.
Oh, it's a disaster.
It's a disaster. And the UN Security Council recently sent a delegation to Myanmar, and consisting of all the permanent reps, they were there. But they haven't come with a heavy-handed report. They've just gone there and seen and listening. Oh yes, refugees should go back, all that kind of thing, but nothing in terms of concrete,
Thank you very much.
So I'm sorry, somebody's been waiting for me for 15 minutes, so I'm just writing a note.
Thank you very much. This was a very powerful, strong presentation.
Well, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I have to dash off. I would like to speak more, but
We will
perhaps another
knock
time.
your door. Yes.
Perhaps another time.
Yeah.
Yes.